Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be around the world. Thank you for joining our webinar today. What is your product? My name is Eric Naberg, and I run marketing and operations here at Scrum.org, and I'm joined by Ellen Gottesdiener and Dave West, who will take you through the actual questions and help out. I will be moderating, taking questions from the audience, as well as I've got some prepared questions and some ideas around it. So Ellen and Dave, if you'd like to introduce yourself briefly.
Ellen, you start.
Oh, okay, we're gonna do ladies first then. All right, Dave. Hi, everyone. Nice to be joining you here today. I'm a product coach focused mostly on technology-driven products, and my focus is on bringing technology and business people together to infuse both product thinking and agile practices to have better products. Dave?
Great. Yeah, so my name's Dave West. I'm CEO, product owner here at Scrum.org. The reason why which isn't really part of my introduction, but the reason why I invited Ellen to join us on this webinar was because Ellen and I, we've known each other a reasonably long time, and we did a product event probably 3 years ago that was the most fun I've had talking about product, and it's just taken me 3 years to organize this webinar. Where we discussed with a large group of people some of the ideas around product thinking and about some of the challenges and around the roles. So I really wanted to get this conversation going because it's a really interesting conversation. So I'm excited that Ellen's here. I'm excited to be here because this is a passion of mine as well. As everybody that knows me. So hopefully we're going to have some fun today talking about products and talking about what is your product.
Awesome. Well, let's get started because I want to hear what we have to talk about and get your thoughts and opinions. And this is something that people often are struggling with. How do we define a product? So let's get right into it. If we can go to the next slide real quick. Just so you know how to ask your questions, some quick guidelines. You will be muted throughout, but we are taking your questions. So please ask those questions in the questions box in your GoToWebinar panel. There's some directions and some information there on how to do so. And with that, let's get to the next slide, please. So first off, how do you define a product? Lots of people struggle with this. You see it in organizations. Sometimes it becomes territorial. There's a new version of the Scrum Guide out, Dave, that talks about, for the first time, really defining more about what is a product. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I'll just start with the definition around in the Scrum Guide, because Scrum has always been product centric. I mean, product owner, product backlog, incremental change to a product. And that's caused a lot of challenges with people. They're like, well, I'm working on an application, I'm working on a business process, I'm working on a genetic, like a cure for cancer or whatever. How can I use Scrum? So in this release of the Scrum Guide, Jeff and Ken included a sort of definition to try to provide some context to what product means in the Scrum Guide. And I will read it, even though I know everybody can read it because it always sounds better with an English accent, right? A product is a vehicle to deliver value. So I think the first point is super important. Jeff and Ken in the Scrum Guide, Jeff Sutherland, Ken Schwaber, the co-creators of Scrum, really emphasize the fact that that Scrum is not about doing work, though you obviously have to do that, unfortunately. It's not magic, right? It's about delivering value. And a product ultimately is that collection of capability that delivers that value. It has a clear boundary. That's super important, because one of the problems I see on many projects is that they don't understand the boundary of the work, and that can lead to a lot of confusion. It has stakeholders, so the people that come to the sprint review often, or proxies for them, which is sometimes the case, so that they provide insight around the work that you're doing. They have people that, use it or pay for it and support it in some way. And then it could be a service, a physical product. You know, it literally could be something like a cell phone, which is not on mute, so I need to change that. It could be a car, it could be a rocket ship. They're the products I'm interested in. Or it could be a service, or it could be something more abstract, like maybe the product is actually something around more of a mission, more of a journey, more of a, you know, something that's I don't know,
So,
something
so
a little bit
want
more
to,
abstract.
yeah, so I want to go over to Ellen on this. And one thing that jumps out to me that's in both of these definitions as well is that word value.
Value.
Right? Value shows up. What are some of your thoughts, Ellen?
Yeah, and I like the definition that, Dave, that you just went through, and that is the thing that jumped out at me. That's the synergistic, that it's about providing value and who you're providing value to. One of the things that is a shift in modern product management, I think you could say, is the focus on the customer. And we need to focus on the customer because they're the ones that are, they're the ones that matter. They define what is value. But also in our definition, you see and business partners, because you can serve the customers really well, but go out of business. So there's a balancing act that you have to have. And the last part of the Scrum Guide definition talks about the way it could manifest itself, right? So it could be an application or a system, you know, a device, service, or combination. And that, when we talk later on about scaling, is really important, that it could be a combination of things that from the outside in point of view to the customer, you know, I don't need to know or care about this application and this device is part of it, and I call a call center and that's part of the whole product as a whole, right? You go banking and you have trouble, you can't get into your account. Well, their call center might be a service that's part of the overall product from my perspective, right? I'm not looking at the call center as a separate product and being able to access my account as a separate product. So that's a really important part of our definition of product, and thinking more broadly about product is really important.
It's something I always think about is whole. I always talk about whole product. Yeah. I think people get caught in their silos, and what you're describing there, Ellen, is that concept of whole product. What does it really mean to bring this product to market and be complete and the like? Dave, you had some thoughts there?
Yeah, I just want to, you know, this is another thing that's super interesting when people are working in teams responsible for a product. Obviously, most products use additional services that they provide. Maybe it's running on AWS if it's a software product. Maybe if it's a car, it's using an entertainment system from X or Y. Ownership and responsibility and accountability for that product. Even though that bit may fail, they may not deliver it. Ultimately, the success of that product is all of those things, and it is ultimately the accountability and the responsibility of that product team and product owner or product manager, the people that are delivering that value, even all of the elements that are outside their control. That's the thing that's so annoying about modern product development in particular. I mean, just think about it. You're doing Netflix, you're dependent on an entire massive infrastructure that's got nothing to do with you. People's phones, people's, the cable, the cable providers' infrastructure, the boxes they use. But ultimately, the service and the quality of the service is defined by all of those elements. You can't get away with saying, "Well, sorry, yeah, well that was your cable provider." Well, you can get away with it, but your customer probably won't be particularly happy if you say that.
Yes, awesome. And that also means if that customer base is so broad, like you're talking about, Dave, with a massively large product, you really have to know your customers, and not all customers are created equal. So how you incrementally deliver that product, whether it's the service or technology capabilities, whatever, it may vary depending on your understanding of that customer, that market, and the strategy that you have and your competition. So it's a very broad understanding of customers that's really needed, particularly in large products.
Yeah, that's a bit hard.
So let's jump to the first question here, if we can jump to the next slide. So what are the principles that define product? And as I think through this and think about what we're talking about, there's so many ways to define a product, and organizations often will argue about what is a product even, or my product and your product. Well, no, it's really one product. Is Microsoft Office a product, or is Word a product? Can you talk a little bit about some of the principles, and maybe start with Ellen on how we define product?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing is, I think of principles first from the outside in. So it's who is the customer? And, in the case where you have the same customer, you might be talking about one product. And later on, we'll talk about some ways to suss that out. So that's the first thing. You start from the outside in with the customer. The next thing is you have to look at the long view. So, in product management, marketing, there was a model, Kettler and Keller, I believe, that had sort of an arc where they talked about the life cycle of a product, being from initiation to, brain is going, but initiation to growth to maturity, decline, that's it.
Yeah.
Or introduction, growth, maturity, decline, those four stages. So you have to think of the product from the art of the long view, if you will, the whole entire life cycle. And any one of us could be working on a product that could be in different life cycle stage. So what we do and the decisions that we make may be calibrated based on that, on the life cycle stage. So that's another important way to a principle for defining. And then the other thing, which Dave and you and I sort of got to that a little bit in a few minutes ago, is that you want to think of the product as broadly as possible, or as broadly as practical. And that has a whole bunch of benefits that both in the development and the pain and hardship of the relationships, and it reduces dependencies and all this other stuff. So it needs to be defined as broadly as practical, right? And then the next thing is that you want to do it collaboratively. This is not like one person saying, okay, here's what your product is. Some years ago, I worked with an organization that took some think tank people, and they were told, we want to become product centric. What are our products? And they went and created some meta models and meta models and meta models and said, oh, here, leadership, this is what our products are. That doesn't work. We need to be engaged and interactively defining that product. And then with all of that in place, right, outside in, the art of the long view, as broadly as possible, do it collaboratively. With that in place, then, this gets to an org structure issue, then the structure of your organization needs to follow what that product is. So there's an alignment between how you organize and what your real products are.
Yeah, so Conway's law kind of model, as it were, the relationship between the architecture of the things that you deliver needs to be supported by the organization that enables it, as it were. That's interesting. I just want to riff a little bit on the define the boundary as broadly as possible. So one thing I have to say from my experience is, immaterial of what the actual boundary ends up being, it needs to be transparent and understood by everybody. One thing that I see a lot of problems in organizations, and Ellen, you're a lot closer to this than me often, because you're actually in doing it, whereas I just ponce around going, oh, that looks very interesting. Let's talk about it for an hour. Is that I see this, I think that I own this whole thing, or this team's very focused on this whole thing, and then the stakeholders think that it's something else, and then the customer thinks it's something else, or the user thinks it's something else, and the people in support and operations that manage it in the day-to-day think it's something else. Everybody's got a different view of both the team's accountability to it and the actual thing, what it is. The team thinks they're responsible for a series of applications. The stakeholders think the team's responsible for a part of the business process. Support thinks that they're responsible for claims, whatever that is. The customer thinks, there's all these disconnects. So define it as broadly as possible, and then make sure that everybody agrees that this is the product that you're working on. Describe that boundary and describe the things that it's not as well as it is. Like, we're responsible for this part of the value stream, right? Or the business process. This is it. This is all we do. These are the inputs. These are the outputs. These are the dependencies. This is the environment. This is how we measure success. So it's got some sort of goal tied to it. And this is how we measure failure, the reverse. That, I think that's super important as well, because I see a lot of confusion about why teams are here, what their boundary is. And that causes a lot of problems later on when the customer doesn't get what they want because the team thinks they're doing something slightly different.
Yeah, totally. And that's why we want to do this definition work together and transparently. And everybody does need to see where they fit into the big picture. Not just that my piece is, maybe you could call it a component. I'm not talking about a technical component, but an element of the big picture. And really, who are our customers? And I love the point that you made, Dave. You need to know, how do you measure success? So you may have a piece that you're working on in, say, part of the customer's entire journey. And whatever your success metrics are going to roll up into the overall success metrics or customer outcomes, right? So if maybe the stuff that you're working on at a certain point in time is around product launch, and the metrics for onboarding are clear, how maybe it's how long does it take to onboard a customer, well, that's going to roll up into higher level product customer outcome metrics, I should say, around retention and acquisition, right? So everybody needs to understand how that all, and that's exciting, and it gives you purpose when you can understand all of that.
It only gives you purpose and exciting when two other elements are connected to it. One is incentives, meaning that your incentives are tied to it in some way. Because I've myself have worked on things where I'm spending all my time fixing things that then when it comes to my review, they're like, well, you weren't responsible for doing that, so I don't know why you're doing that. So one, incentives, and the other thing is empowerment. I think it's, the other thing that really, really annoys people is, hey, we're going to make you responsible for all of this. This is what the product is. Everybody agrees. But by the way, you can't change anything. And by the way, you have to do what we tell you. And by the way, we're going to give you impossible missions. And it's going to be awesome because you own all of this. And you're like, great. I think it reminds me of the English soccer team, World Cup soccer team. This is your mission. Now, unfortunately, we'll only give you 2 weeks to train, and the Premier League season will destroy you physically, so you won't be able to actually do it. But it's your mission. But anyway, so I think that works.
The point about empowerment, that's actually a big point when I'm working with organizations, and I recently took on an enterprise product coaching roles, and this is a thing that is very much tied. Empowerment and decision making is very much tied to understanding what your product is, as well as that whole topic around roles, product management, product ownership. But putting that aside, the E word is being used a lot in many organizations, empowerment. Well, what does that mean around product decisions that you have? What are you, quote, empowered? What are your rules for making decisions? And do we have a transparent way to go about deciding how to decide for the product that we've defined? There's a lot emotionally in that and organizationally in that I find, particularly with large products, is not addressed very as transparently as it could be for the health and well-being of the people and the product itself.
So there are a couple of questions coming in that kind of tie together a bit. So I wanted to see if we can pull them together, and I'll try to summarize. Samuel, Lucas, a couple others have asked similar questions, or at least tying them in. They're around value, and you've been talking a lot about value, and both definitions, as I mentioned, have value in them. Samuel talks about, everything we do should bring value. An application provides value, but it may not be a product by itself. Maybe it's part of a value stream. I know, Dave, you helped edit the book on value streams, so you probably got some thoughts here. So why the emphasis so much on value in terms of product? And then Lucas goes on to kind of talk about, what happens when there's distance between the development team's perspective of value or perception of value and the customer's perception of value. How, as a product owner, can we start to pull those together? I think I know they're different questions, but I think they're really closely related as you think about describing value and defining value. Why is value so important? But now, how do we make sure that we're aligned on what we mean by value?
I'll start. Value is, we talk very easily about value. You've got to make sure that the thing you're doing is clearly tied to value. You need to measure it. You need to, in an empirical process, get feedback, and then you inspect and adapt, and value happens. But value is often the hardest thing to define in anything that you do every day. And it is very subjective, it is very contextual, it is very political, it is absolutely a minefield. And a good product owner and a product manager, agile product manager, whatever you want to call these people, that one of their principal jobs is to work with all of these stakeholders and try to define how you think about the value in the context of this product, and how you measure it, and how you report on it, and basically make it transparent. Now, in the case of the example around an application delivers value in a much bigger value stream, and the product team's responsible for that application and not responsible for that value stream, the most important thing that you do is make that then transparent. Say, hey, this is what the team's doing. This is how we measure success. Numbers of transactions, numbers of defects, numbers of whatever those things are for the application. And yes, it isn't revenue, it isn't customer retention, it isn't those things, but that's our focus. And then when the stakeholders around that say, oh no, then there's a really interesting opportunity, because you get that opportunity to say, okay, well, if you don't think that's what we should be measured on and what we think is important and what we think value is, then what do you think? And how do we start working out these disconnects? Because that conversation leads to an incredible moment of enlightenment between everybody. It either leads to the fact that the business thinks of you purely as those guys in the basement that do stuff, and they don't really care about your relationship with them, and then that's okay. Then we're going to do the stuff that they think we should do brilliantly, and that's how we're going to measure our success. Or it means that you've got more of a seat at the table and you can start having a much better conversation. Ellen, that must be what you spend your whole life trying to negotiate, that conversation on value, right?
Well, not my whole life, because that would be very sad, but some of it.
Would it be valuable? Sorry.
So that, generically speaking, the word value is about what you get for what you give up, right? That's sort of a high level. What you invest, you may invest your time and you get back like playing with a new app online because you like the fun, right? You may invest real money and you get back time saving in another product. The other thing I think is really important with value is in the eyes of the beholder. Yeah. So value is in the eyes of the beholder. So the first thing is we need to know who the beholders are. And you use the S word, the stakeholders. I like to think of those people as coming from three different realms: the customer, the business, and technology. Customer, business, and technology. And then at a high level with that, with the topic of value, what's valuable to the customer at a really high level, that the product is desirable. And desirability is usually that it's useful and usable for them, right? So customer, product partner, if you will, values desirability. The business, you have to have something viable, and it has to be viable so you stay in business and can grow your business, grow your market, etc. And then from the technology, that part of the partnership it's about feasibility. So we have to balance desirability, viability, and feasibility. We have to know who those partners are, those stakeholders, as is commonly called, and what they value. And then the really super incredibly difficult, hard work of product leadership is making trade-off decisions, taking in all your strategic work, looking at the market, the competition, trends, technology trends as well, and making decisions on your strategy. And because you can't, again, values in the eyes of the beholder, you can't please all of those people. You can't make them all happy. So I often, you say spend a lot of time on that. It is actually kind of very fundamental. You have to first, define your product. And as you're defining the product, one of the beautiful things about really defining your product is it forces you to do that outside-in work and think about those three partners, customer, business, and technology, and what they value. And that really gets you head and heart close to what the product really is and who it serves and the big why behind the product.
Yeah. I just want to add, before we sort of, there's another element to that I find really interesting. Obviously viability, feasibility, they're important. There's another cultural fit as well. There's a sort of context that any decision that you make has to work in. And that might be defined by the mission of the business. That might be defined by the nature of the business. We're very conservative. We don't take risks, those sort of things. Or we're extremely like, the sort of Google model or the Amazon model where try and experiment. If it fails, we learn something. Or Elon Musk who'll blow up engines like they're going out of fashion just because, And, the culture and the context, that cultural viability is also incredibly important. And as a product leader, you have to spend your time balancing, negotiating, making things transparent, deciding which priorities you're going to make around that, because you can't keep everybody happy, but you can definitely make everybody unhappy. So that's the, sort of like, it's like the opposite, you know what I mean? So you have to actually deliver something. So
one of the questions that often comes up, and I've had this discussion a lot with folks, is, so yes, the customer or the user sees value and they see $1 worth of value. It's value and it's going to save them whatever, but it costs us $2 to build. Right? And this is where I think, Ellen, as you're talking about, you've got multiple types of stakeholders that you have to work with to really define and understand that value. Yes, there's great value, but we're going, as this stakeholder, we're going to lose money. As this stakeholder, I'm going to get tremendous value. And now we have to start to make some decisions, and these are where the really hard decisions come in, as to, well, do we cut and run? Do we look at a way to scope this so that we can deliver the value to the customer while still delivering some value to the organization and the like? I'd like to move on. We're getting a lot of questions coming in, but we also, I think they tie to some of the things that you prepared to talk about. So I want to jump down. I want to skip the next slide, Lindsay, and go down one more, because we've kind of talked about is everything a product already, and talk about what are some of the tools and techniques that can help a team define this. And as I think about it, and you've talked about some of this, and some of the questions really hit on this, we struggle to define it. We just struggle to define product. How have you worked with some folks to define product? What are some of the tools, some of the techniques that you've used, Ellen, to really help people get their heads around this definition of product and better define it? And I look at a question, for example, Rich asks a question. I find it difficult to convert leadership from a project thinking to a product thinking idea and thoughts. What are some of the tools and techniques that you've done to help change that? Right? I think these all tie together very nicely.
Yeah. Yes, I've actually had the honor of being able to work with a number of organizations and try out different techniques, and some of them, first you're starting with the outside in point of view with the customer, and before I talk about some of the specific tools and techniques, you can always start with asking your customers, or who you think your customers, well, what do you think our product is? You know, that's a very simple, immediate fallback. But another thing that I've developed that over the years, starting from years ago when I was a product coach at Zipcar, is something called a product canvas. And in the canvas, there's 2 parts of the canvas, but the canvas has blocks on it that address areas such as the vision and those 3 partners and the channels and competitive stuff. But how you go about filling the blocks out is what's really important. So first of all, many people listening probably understand about visioning techniques, thinking about what your vision is. I mean, there's a whole slew of really great techniques, from a product box to using a mandala, a one-liner. Okay, that's great. But one really simple thing that is on part 2 of the canvas is to understand the product. Just take a picture of the product by creating something called a context diagram. Now, this thing goes back, since dirt, right, Dave? I mean, this is like 30, 40-year-old technique, but it's a really very elegantly simple thing. You draw a circle, and that's let's say that's your product, that's your scope, that's the context. The boxes around it are external entities, and the arrows going in and out, or the innies and outies, if you will, are the interfaces. Now, just to give you an example with a really, really large product, and this was within an infrastructure group, people thought, okay, they were sort of all in one department of the organization, and they all thought they had a different product. So I put them in teams, and we had leadership, and lead architects, pretty high level people. And we did an example together. I took a neutral sort of product at a medium level of broadness, and we drew it together for about 20 minutes. Then I sent them off into groups and said, okay, draw the context diagram for your product. Show us the interfaces. And then we went around the room and looked at them. Well, if you can imagine that diagram, if you see the same boxes on multiple diagrams and the same interfaces, the information coming in and out is very similar, you're probably looking at the same product. And this was a huge aha for many people. Well, those are the same customers. We have the same customers, and that information is the same. So then that opens up some thinking. And then you can think about use some tools that have been around also since dirt, right, Dave? Like a data model at a high level, and say, well, wait a minute, the data domains are all very similar. We're dealing with, this data domain, this data, the information that we're storing, persisting, that's the same in yours and in mine. And wait a minute, let's draw a picture. Who are the roles that interact with the product? Create a role map, right? So using some very simple techniques that have been around for a long time to get your arms around this thing, those are some really useful tools at a starting point. And the one thing I would do first, though, is I often will give them some pre-reading to do about, what is a product, and thinking about a customer and outside in, and come up with a glossary, very simple glossary for what is what product, defining a product, like using the Scrum guides or the one that we have. What is a component? What is a feature? Because those things are often, and have an example from that company. And they have to study and look at that ahead of time. Yeah. So one other technique I'll share that sometimes I'll do even before the context diagram exercise is if they've looked at that glossary, so they have some kind of foundational understanding, then ahead of time we say, what do you think all the products are? Let's write them on cards. In one organization, they had 26 of them. Another, it was 54 of them. And what we did was put a poster on the wall, do this virtually in Miro or Mural here these days, and with a column of is a product, is not a product, not sure, and have them sort these things based on that glossary definition and do that in multiple rounds. And then all of a sudden people start to see, oh, they start thinking a little more broadly. So those are some of the things that I found work. How about you?
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of questions that kind of tied to it, Dave. So that I think will help kind of guide your pieces. And I just want to say thank you. You made me smile, Ellen. I spent several years as a product owner for a data modeling product.
And,
So you made me smile a little bit.
and he wrote a book about data modeling. So Ellen, you really did just basically make Eric feel like those 3 years of his life were worthy. I still question it, but he seems to be pretty happy about it now.
So Dave, kind of tying into this, one of the questions Brian asks is, requirements of a product are going to change throughout.
Yeah.
Right? They're going to change while we're in development. What are some of the techniques, tying into what Ellen said, to test the product, get feedback, be able to pivot if we need, or do we need to take a sharp pivot? Maybe it's slight changes. Some techniques and things that you've done or ideas. And there's a lot in Scrum that can help describe this. Thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, so I'm really a big fan of the Lean UX work of Jeff and Josh, and the way that what they encourage is they encourage us to rapidly test hypothesis. So understand what our hypotheses are around the product, and rapidly build the lowest cost way of testing that, and use the team to decide that. So it can be paper prototypes, it can be a questionnaire, it can be a button on a website that just you click and says, hey, this feature's not there yet. Whatever those things are, excuse me, whatever those things are, but do it in the cheapest possible way to test the hypothesis. Building it into code and building it into the increment might not be the best way of doing it. I know that's sort of heresy for Scrum, sometimes we say, but sometimes building the sustainable elements of this product, it might not be the best way to experiment with something up front. Some of these requirements might require a detailed analysis. They might require those things are still very relevant in Scrum. We don't throw those things out. And then what that often does, though, as you experiment with things, you find issues of boundary, you find issues of interface, and then that gives you the ability, and Scrum would do it in the sprint review, but obviously you don't have to wait for then, to get your stakeholders or business partners, as Ellen talks to them, to validate that. But one thing that you shouldn't ever do is basically make massive assumptions and then invest lots and lots of money in an assumption if you haven't actually validated it early. And I would do things like that all the time. Paper prototyping, surveys, questionnaires, talk to people, interviews, those techniques are really low fidelity prototyping. All of those things can be, you can also do physical. I love there's these particular techniques where you bring users in and actually create things in a physical way. So you go through a business process or you go through a flow with them to make that very visible. Those things are incredibly powerful, I find, because the one problem we do have often in our industry is things are very abstract, aren't they? We talk about things, we abstract them, data models and context diagrams. Oh God, I can't believe you said context diagram. I love context diagrams. Obviously, made me think of soft systems, Peter Checkland's work. It made me think of SSADM, those techniques, but they can be a little abstract. I remember because, Eric and I, back in our, when we had hair, well, Eric did, I don't think I ever did. We'd use UML. So of course we'd take customers through UML models all the time and they go, oh yes. And they'd get into it because we were reasonably good at, I don't know, getting them drunk or something. They'd get into it. And then the next thing you know, you build this thing, you're like, well, you said, and they're like, well, that's what you meant by that? Because it was but don't you realize that's an inheritance, not an aggregation? So of course that works like that. And they'd go, no, I didn't. So making things physical can be incredibly powerful.
Yes,
That's what I found anyway.
I mean, we sort of shifted from defining the product to the ongoing requirement, the healthy life cycle of a product and how you suss out requirements. And I totally agree that and that mindset, that hypothesis testing mindset, is super important. And we sort of stole that from science. I do have to say, because I'm married to a research scientist, and you know, when we talk about this with software, and he said, like, well, that's not really how it works with science. But one of the things that my husband Jeffrey pointed out is that when you do hypothesis testing as a scientist, you actually expect to be wrong. You don't expect to be right. So it's a different mindset. So when you do run these hypothesis tests, the mindset of let's try to be a little less wrong in this test so that we can learn what might be, get closer to what might be right. It's a very different mindset, you know, that you have. Dave,
Yeah, well, that's true. I've got a couple of examples. Well, one is just to talk a great interview of Elon Musk back on when SpaceX was relatively new, and they had this, they got somebody from the normal world to do interview him. It was a webcast thing instead of like a proper journalist. And this STEM, she was a STEM student lady, and she was asking, she goes, how likely is it going to be, you know, you get the rocket up and then, you know, are you worried about it? He goes, oh my God, he goes, I think it's 60% likely it's going to explode. And she went, what? And it was literally quite close to them. And she went and looked at it and looked very scared. He goes, and you know, we'll learn so much if it does. And then she interviewed him afterwards. She goes, oh, you know, you must be excited. You know, it was a 40, 60 and it went up. And he goes, yeah, but I think we would have learned more if it had exploded.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if he was being facetious because he has that style, right? But, you know, your husband, Jeffrey, obviously, the scientific method is ultimately to disprove rather than prove, you know, and that's the sort of mantra of that and building those hypotheses. The other thing that it made me think of is the sprint review. One thing that we are all guilty of in our sprint reviews is we go, oh, look at this, show it off. Isn't it beautiful? And under the hood, and Eric and I can attest to this, having worked on products together, under the hood is like, you know, it's broken horribly, there's things hard coded, but we're showing you the prettiness because even though we know the sprint review isn't a demo, but we want the adoration of the stakeholders because we're humans and we kind of need it. You know, we like people being proud of what we've done and we want to feel proud ourselves, right? So if you flip that on the head and you go in that learning stance and you say, these are the things we don't really understand. These are the things we tried, but we're not sure. Then that changes the dynamic massively. And going in not from everything's perfect, but going in the exact opposite, you know, the pessimistic.
Well, one of the things that was removed from the 2020 version of the Scrum Guide is actually that word demo for the sprint review. The sprint review used to talk about you demonstrate blah, blah, blah. And the problem is you get into sales mode. So you go, instead of feedback mode, you think demo. Well, what am I doing in a demo? I'm trying to sell my stakeholders on why the work I just did or that my team just did was so incredible. And you get into that mode. So you need to remove yourself from that mindset in the sprint review that I'm here to get feedback. I'm here to improve for next sprint, not show off what we just did. And I think that's different. Simon kind of flips this question a little bit on its head. And I think it's interesting. I want to bring it in. You know, what tangible problems do you tend to see that are caused by poorly defined products? And how can we work to make that more transparent? He says the Scrum Master, but in general, you know, what are some of the problems that you do see when we're not defining product well or not defining the product requirements well?
Yeah. Well, the product well or the product requirements? Because those are separate.
Product. Sorry, the product.
Okay. Well, what do you see? One of the first things that you see is a massive amount of dependencies. And then that yields, and many backlogs, because they've defined the product very narrowly. You have a team has its own little backlog. Maybe they even make the mistake of having a product owner per team versus product owner per backlog, which brings up a wonderful addition to the 2020 guide. And so there's lots of backlogs, And then you have to start coordinating priorities across all these backlogs with these ill-defined products that are probably, often better defined more broadly. So then you end up with more coordinator roles, and you see that, whatever you want to call that role, but they have to coordinate all the different priorities of the different backlogs. You see these governance or oversight processes that involve leaders that just slow everything down. It's like sludge to get approval. So decision making becomes more diffuse. It's most likely not transparent anyway. So it slows down, it's an anti-pattern to actually what most people's goals of using lean agile practices are. You might see if they have roadmaps and strategies, they're competing for the same people. You'll see component teams that are, this product, this narrowly defined product wants me, this one wants me, this one wants me, where do I go? So then you have more governance to make those decisions. It just slogs down the works just incredibly. And in the end, not only the teams and the people get lost and frustrated, and it's just hard to get it. It's a lot of friction, but the customers get hurt and the business gets hurt. Your ultimate, customer outcomes and business results get hurt. It sounds kind of painful, and it is, but that's like the sort of the worst case scenario. Dave, have you seen that kind of stuff?
Yeah, exactly. That my smell-o-vision, when I go in and I know the product's badly defined, I go in and I smell conflict, and I smell lots of people in meetings, no decisions being able to be made, everybody pointing their fingers at other people, usually because of the dependency thing. We're not sure who's on first. And usually the organizations that survive in this mess is there's one man or woman that is literally just sort of allowing them to sort of go around in crisis and just is basically pulling everything together and delivering the real product, as it were. The conflict that a poorly defined product creates and the lack of trust that it manifests is just you can't help. It's just huge. And then everybody just does this every day, and it's just awful. And I think though the things that the telltale signs that and the fact that the people, when they're talking about, when you say, because I always ask Adam, like you, I was like, okay, tell me a little bit about your product. And when they smirk, that smirk where they know that it's not a product, they know that what they're doing actually is they're a team where work's being allocated to their backlog, and that they have no real ownership of that work or no real relationship with the outcomes associated with that work. They're just basically a bunch of people working on a list of stuff that's being given to them, and their product owner really is just trying to make sure that list doesn't get too long, and that the work that they deliver keeps some other people happy in the least possible way. They know, but of course they pretend, like everybody, that they're doing product and the like. And I that's what I see. That smirk is always a giveaway. And they go, well, our product is complicated. That's what they always say as well.
I think one of the things that's interesting, right? Scrum brought in, again, in the 2020 guide, the concept of a product goal, and really helping by defining that. We've talked about vision, but sometimes the problem with vision is it can be so grandiose. And we almost lose track of what are we really doing? That product goal, and even the sprint goal, which has always been there, but the product goal and the sprint goal now get us to really focus more and force us in some ways to better define what it is we're trying to do and what it is we're trying to achieve. And I think that becomes important. Lindsay, if we can jump to the next slide, the next question kind of ties into this a bit. And I also want to be conscious of time, and we don't need to, the slides are not as important as what the audience is certainly asking, and I want to try to get to some more of these questions. Christian asked a really good question here, which I think kind of ties to scaling, ties to a few different things, but If the team is in fact responsible for the entire process, within which, in this case, an IT application is just a piece of it, how do you define the product? Is it a service? Is it more than just the application? This gets back to, I think, Ellen, what you were talking about in whole product. Can you talk a little bit more about that concept of whole product and how do we bring the whole team together? And then Dave, maybe as Ellen's talking about this, think about, in Scrum, it doesn't have to just be the coders on the Scrum team. So maybe you can add some to that, Ellen.
Yeah, I mean, Eric, you really hit it in terms of with a scaled product, you need to think very broadly. That's the first thing, and think about the whole product. So there could be many applications that are almost like components to the overall product. There could be services that are provided when we think more broadly. Some years ago, I was working with a team that provided database, cloud, and other types of databases to a gigundous firm. And when one of the preparation activities in the product definition workshop that I was facilitating was I assigned the product leader and the lead engineer to do as a pair do customer interviews. Gave them a customer interview protocol, and they had to come in prepared to share pains, gains, and jobs to be done for these different customers, which some of you might be familiar with is the right side of the value proposition canvas. And then, so they put that up on the wall, and then we actually did some live interviews for those people that couldn't participate in an interview. I'm going like this because some of them were video. We were interviewing some people in the UK, we were in the US. And one of the things that became very clear that was a pain point that this team hadn't thought of, because they were just thinking about the technologies that they were providing, was, all right, an application developer or somewhere in a line of business might need to order a database and request space. And it could be a cloud database, it could be a SQL Server database, whatever. But one of the struggles was the team thought, well, we're doing a great job. We're giving a little app. They have a place they can go, a portal that they can place the order. But yeah, the problem is sometimes, even though the app developers are super smart people and have an architecture background, they don't know what all these vendor products provide. And given the value proposition, whether it's reducing operational costs or being able to do quick retrieval, they don't know this. So they were missing understanding in this conversation, in this work, they were missing that there was a service that really needed to be part of their product, a consulting service to help those app developers who were their customers, they were internal customers, to help them understand and learn, what database do I need? What do I choose? You gave me this ordering platform, but I don't really know, right? So that's sort of getting people's minds around this idea of whole product thinking. It's not just around the technology, and I think we can get really technology people, we can get sucked into that as the product. There's more surround, there's more to the whole product. And then we can talk about local versus global optimization, but we'll hold that off because Dave, I think.
Well, yeah, that's going to be a big one. I'm not totally sure I'm locally optimized at the moment, Alan. The people that are in the team. So one thing that we often have done is when we've adopted Scrum, we've taken our existing departmental structure, which was based around an efficiency mindset around the work that's being done. So the people that are working on RP 150, which was, by the way, my first job out of university, RP 150 was the bane of my life. It was a claims app for a large insurance company, and they'd lost some of the source code. So I always go back to RP 150, and we had to basically just drop. It was, yeah, we couldn't get it anyway. So RP 150. So you optimize, you've got a skilled technical team aimed at that. And when you bring in Scrum, you say, or any agile approach, we'll just do, it's just replacing the projects with this concept of product owner, or that was the team lead, right? And blah, blah, blah. And they do that. And that is exactly the wrong thing. because what you've done is you've basically just, and maybe you'll get a more efficient team, maybe, making things transparent, working. Maybe they even might do some cross-skilling inside the team, but ultimately you won't deliver the benefits of an agile approach to the value that the product needs. So I think you have to bring in, you have to think about the product and think about the team that you need to build holistically. Get in the right developers. Do not all software engineers, not all business. And then when you realize you've got this humongous team, then you can start thinking about how you can break up the value stream so that there's clear ownership, but not think about it from the skills and the like. And then that might highlight the fact that your product's doing too much, your expectations are unrealistic. One big problem with Scrum, and Ellen, you and I talk about this a bit, is you have to make choices. And modern organizations hate making decisions and choices, particularly if they actually will have some sort of outcome, some sort of result because of them. They're like, oh, well, we want it all, right? Everything's a priority one. Well, no, it's not. And I hate to say this, Alan, I don't know if you've experienced this talking about scaling. I actually don't see effective product organizations over a few, 100 or so people, for one product. Now, you might say, well, it's all the levels of abstraction. It's turtles all the way down, right? You could break that up into multiple products, but then they need to have a clear boundary. They need to make sense. I think, as Scotty on Star Trek would say, you cannot change the laws of physics. And there's certain physical constraints that we have around how humans in a complex world can work together. And that means that the boundary of our products are sized in the same way as, Amazon with the, 2 pies, or, the pizza thing, or the whatever. Anyway, I kind of talked about a lot of things there.
So I want to be conscious of time and respectful for the time of our audience.
Yeah,
We've got only a few minutes left. So if we want, maybe Dave, you go first, and then Ellen, just some closing thoughts on this complex problem of defining a product.
Oh,
you can go first, Ellen, right? Or did I say?
Ellen, I go first. Doesn't matter.
No, you can go first. I don't. Shall I go first?
Go for it.
All right. Sorry, I was too busy thinking about my thoughts to actually hear the end part of your sentence there, Eric. So I think the most important thing is to actually get it up on paper somewhere. Whether you're using context diagrams, which I'm so glad Ellen mentioned, because it's sort of, I didn't realize those brain cells still worked, or whether you're using, I love your Canvas, Ellen. I think it's a really great tool, and hopefully we'll provide some linkages to that in the materials so that people can use it, because it's awesome. But whatever it is, don't spend weeks trying to find the perfect way of describing it. Just get it up there. Get working on it together. Ellen talked about collaboration. Make it visible, make it transparent, and then inspect and adapt it. Remember, when you define your product, in the first week of your engagement, it's gonna change because you're learning stuff. And so it's important that you actually have time to review it and to say, hey, so we've just done 3 sprints. Do we think this is right now? And actually challenge those things. And and obviously I really like the Scrum definition of product in terms of the things that are important, the boundary, the custom users and business partners, also stakeholder, I'm trying to use Ellen's terms there. How you measure success, those things are super important, and I've talked too much.
Thanks, Dave. Ellen, closing
thoughts?
That
was great, because you said, the idea of
slide 10.
Start with something and do this transparently, be transparent about it and collaborative about it is absolutely critical, because, the product development is about the ongoing evolution of a high value product. So how you and it defines how you define your product drives everything that you do. So this is that's got to be the first thing that you do. And even, many of you listening are in flight, pause and ask the question, what is our product? And understand who the customers are and what they value, and try to go as broad as possible, some of the principles that we talked about, but do it collaboratively and transparently. I would just echo, Dave, what you just said there.
Awesome. Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Dave. I want to again thank the audience taking the time out of your busy days. I know we're so tied to our headsets and our screens these days. It can be overwhelming, and there's a lot of great questions we didn't get to. We'll try to get to them via email and respond directly to you all as well. And with that, thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care. Stay safe.
Bye all. Thank you.